are at our best when we're together. And when we do not have that feeling of being connected with others, biologically, not only psychologically, we feel under threat and vulnerable. And of course, there's individual differences, but we're wired to be that way. We are a social species and we need each other to go through this life together.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're going to take a fast-track course in building bridges to belonging. We're talking with a social psychologist, Geoffrey Cohen, who has spent decades studying how to improve our ability to forge lasting connections, how to reinforce our own and others' sense of belonging. Cohen is James G. March Professor of Organizational Studies in Education and Business at Stanford University. And his research offers more than hope. It actually shows us that concrete solutions do exist and that they work. So the yearning to belong, it's a powerful driving factor in human behavior. We all fundamentally want to fit in. And although we may acknowledge that our own need exists to belong, most of us don't fully appreciate that others need that too. Sometimes even inadvertently, we threaten others' sense of belonging, adding to the bigger societal problem of siloed isolation. We all know the horrible pain of being excluded, which, if left to ferment, can erupt into anger and violence. But take courage, says Cohen. Small positive acts can have lasting effects, and he outlines many examples in his book entitled Belonging, the Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides. Well, we're all ears, Geoffrey. Hello and welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm happy to be here.
So, by definition, belonging means going together, you say. Why is belonging such a powerful driving factor, and why is it so vital to human thriving?
We've evolved as a species to go through life together. We're very vulnerable out there in the wilderness and in the wild. We really do, as a species, need each other. Alone, we're incredibly vulnerable to predation and physical wounding. And evolutionarily, for that reason, it made a lot of adaptive sense for us to work together to solve problems and face threats. And so even wired into our DNA as a species, and here I'm just drawing on some seminal work by Matt Lieberman and Naomi Eisenberg, among many others, John Cacioppo, we are at our best when we're together. And when we do not have that feeling of being connected with others, biologically, not only psychologically, we feel under threat and vulnerable. And of course, there's individual differences, but we're wired to be that way. We are a social species and we need each other to go through this life together.
So this feeling of not belonging, this isolation, this not being picked for the team, the being excluded, even you talk about an avatar game of toss in the book, where, well, I'll let you tell what happens.
Well, it reminds me of my experience in elementary school when two sides of a team were picking members for the team, and I was the last one to be picked. And that feeling has really kind of stayed with me to this day. I feel a lot of trepidation in any kind of athletic context. This is work that you're mentioning by Kip Williams, where he, to make a long story short, puts people in this kind of online situation where you're playing a game of virtual catch with strangers, and all of a sudden the strangers, the avatars, stop passing you the ball. Now, unbeknownst to the subjects, those avatars are actually just pre-programmed to not throw you the ball, and they're not real people. Nevertheless, the effect of that experience, as Kip Williams puts it, is pain. Exclusion, even by strangers, hurts. And other research suggests that when we're experiencing that kind of ostracism, the regions in the brain actually associated with registering physical pain are activated, suggesting that social pain is experienced much like physical pain. It really hurts. And so much so that even Lieberman shows taking Tylenol actually reduces some of the pain of rejection.
So it really is a physical thing. It's not all in the.
It's a whole body experience, I would say, too. It's again, because we're wired for the need to belong, to feel connected to others, to be part of a larger group that accepts us, is so biologically ingrained that even minute, seemingly trivial experiences activates that need, so that when we feel threatened, bang, our biology, our psychology react. Now, of course, there's going to be individual differences. People can build up a more sturdy sense of their own belonging, even in strange situations over time. I'm speaking as a kind of general trend, though. These effects tend to be very strong, even in a general population. Even brief experiences of ostracism hurt. And some work actually coming out of UCLA Medical School by Steve Cole and colleagues suggests that loneliness when chronic, ostracism when chronic, is actually a whole body experience. The genes associated with bodily inflammation are switched on so that our whole body, when the experience of exclusion is prolonged, reacts differently and goes into the sort of defensive inflammatory mode, which is a big contributor to cardiovascular disease and many kinds of illnesses and premature death even. So that's, I would say, the strength of the need is indicated by how easily it is toggled on.
It's interesting you raise that historical event being forged into your grey matter, that rejection of the team. I remember talking to a person in a hospital, a doctor, and she was telling me the research they were doing at Mass General on child abuse. She said that babies that were completely ignored by their mothers, i.e. no facial mirroring, no smiles, that damage was worse than abuse in a child. They were finding that there's no capacity in the brain to really process what's going on there. They can't understand. So they turn inward. The child turns inward and thinks there must be something wrong with me. That's very early on.
There are these studies that you can look at online where they bring babies and their caretakers into the lab and have the caretaker not respond to the baby as they usually do. So the baby coos and the mom usually looks away or doesn't make eye contact. And it's very distressing to the infants. This is just a kind of indicator of how really early in our development, we're attuned to the responsiveness of others. And that's kind of how I think throughout our lifespan, we really do feel a kind of sense of authentic connection when we have that sense that people are responding to us, not ignoring us. Their eyes aren't drifting off into space. And we feel as though they're seeing us. They're seeing us. And that's what true belonging comes from, that sense of being seen. And when we feel ignored, ostracized, left out, that's the quickest route to not feeling that way.
You raised 2 points there, which we're going to come back to later. One, the thing about authenticity, which I think is so fundamental in this entire problem that we've got now, the social isolation, social media, not knowing what's authentic and what's real. But anyway, going back historically, so the tribes and groups over time, over millennia, have always hung together and lived communally for the very reasons, right? Survival depended upon it. So when America was being forged and we had the whole rugged individual thing, the frontier person, the success of the individual, did that disrupt this thinking or this bonding, do you think? And if so, maybe was churches or groups like that the way people got around it? They belonged to something bigger than themselves.
Yeah, I think throughout much of human history, we did have that sense of belonging to a tribe or to a family or to a community. And what we find ourselves in now is a world, and perhaps, and especially a society, where there is what Pete Buttigieg called a crisis of belonging. We feel disconnected from others. Social trust is at an all-time low, I think down from 60% about 50 years ago to 30% now, people feeling that they can trust a stranger in this culture. And we have this kind of ideology of individualism, this belief that the individual is the causal source of everything, and that what makes us really happy is pursuing these individualistic gains like status and prestige and wealth, and to some degree that's true. But what really brings us joy is our connections with others, and that kind of gets lost or left out today, I think, in a lot of societies, what are called weird societies, which are, to make a kind of, it's an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures, which are high on individualism. The people that there tend to be unaware of the degree to which social connection is so important in their lives, and they end up making these errors in what they pursue. They end up thinking that what's going to really make me happy is landing that job or getting a lot of money or being really popular. But ultimately in the end, it's our connections with others that are so memorable, I find that in my own personal life. I could almost be doing anything, going to the store, going to Trader Joe's, whatever. And if I'm doing it with someone else, it's just more memorable and more meaningful. And I leave feeling filled up. Today, I think we have a lot of kind of cheap calorie substitutes for connection, such as social media, which can be good in very many ways. But I think especially for a lot of teens, it's a kind of cheap way to get a short-term way, cheap calories for social connection that ends up not being authentic and filling people up and fulfilling them. And I think all of this comes in part from the highly individualistic nature of our culture, the ideology that we have and that we're laboring under, that the individual is the center of everything. That's not to say individualism is a bad thing. You just need individualism and communalism existing side by side. Communalism acts to kind of balance out unbridled individualism. You need both. And actually, to riff on this just one more, for a little bit more, when we feel like we belong, we're actually the more likely to be brave and courageous and seek challenges. I'm thinking of that research by Mary Ainsworth in the 50s and 60s, showing that babies, when they have a secure sense of attachment with their caregiver, they don't huddle close to that caregiver. They're actually more likely to wander off and explore the room and take on challenges. And that happens from the cradle to the grave. If we have that sense of people in our corner, we're more likely to go for it and to reach our potential. So in some ways, individualism, it's a negative for belonging in some ways, but it's not necessarily incompatible with belonging. Belonging is the soil for us to become the full individuals that we are meant to become, I think.
So it's interesting you use the word soil, because you mentioned in the book that loneliness, that painful exclusion. One of the researchers said it was fertilizer for an early death. So there's health consequences.
Yeah. I know, right? There's actually big meta-analysis now just showing that loneliness, social isolation, even just living alone is as bad for you, roughly, in these correlational studies, prospective longitudinal studies, as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So we kind of have an intuitive understanding of how toxic cigarette smoke is, or asbestos in your basement, right? All those things do matter, but these kind of invisible social, psychological, environmental factors can be really toxic too. Being alone, being lonely for a long period of time is, as Steve Cole at UCLA puts it, fertilizer for early death. Our genes start responding differently, and we kind of become bodily inflammation goes up, which is a good thing in response to short-term threats. But when we feel like we're alone, we kind of go into this threat response that, again, is good for short-term threats, but if it's chronically activated, it creates a lot of weathering and wear and tear on the body that is a big contributor to early death and disease.
Makes sense. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Okay, we're being marooned by questions, or it's like already 6 here. Let's try and counter some of this negative stuff that we're talking about now. So you also suggest each of us has the power to nurture flourishing, human flourishing, even in the smallest corners of our lives, you say. So maybe you could give us some examples, maybe classroom examples or work, some areas of research that look promising if you nurture someone, and how do you do that?
One of the reasons I went into this field of social psychology is because I think it's just so great, because it not only underscores problems, but it points the way to solutions. And I've been so lucky to work with so many colleagues over the years, and to be in a field that cares about making the world a better place. There is so much research now illustrating the power of the words we choose or the actions we perform in certain situations to create belonging and to bring out our personal and collective best. I could break these categories of things into two categories. One is the obvious. Obvious things actually do matter. Making eye contact, listening, right? And listening and asking questions to show an interest in a person. I love this research by Sarah Algier, showing that simply expressing gratitude to people. Hey, I really appreciate when you did X. Or she does it with partners or romantic couples. She gives them support to, or kind of instructions to express gratitude just once a day to their partner for something about them. And she finds these whopping effects that the couples end up having stronger feelings for one another, spending roughly an hour more per day in each other's company as a result of that little intervention. Work by Kip Williams shows that simply making eye contact as you walk down the street has positive effects on other people's sense of meaning and connection with the world. These little things really do matter. I know it's obvious, but there's work suggesting that I think roughly 50% of employees leave their company because they don't feel appreciated or because of a toxic work environment. And actually just training leaders to be a little less authoritarian, a little more polite and empowering has large effects on employee retention and morale. So these simple things really do matter. And unfortunately, being polite, being appreciative is one of the first things to go out the window when we feel under stress. So lesson one, the small, obvious things, being polite, being kind, being appreciative, seeing the person really do matter, and expressing it. Number two is a suite of what we could call, what my colleague Greg Walton and Claude Steele call wise interventions. These are kind of more strategic ways in which we can counter some of the larger forces that divide us through theory-based, scientifically designed intervention strategies. So one example of that, there's many, but one is what is referred to as values affirmation, taking the time to simply give people a moment to reflect on their most important values. Who am I? What do I believe in? What do I stand for? What would I die for? Having people, we do these studies on with, for example, middle school kids who are going through a turbulent time in their development, and they often feel excluded and sensitive to the judgments of others. Having middle school students take some time at the beginning of the school year to just jot down their most important values and write about why they're important, like relationships, compassion, purpose, improve their grades. And actually, years and years later, as a result of just taking a few minutes to jot down their values at this key developmental stage, increase the percentage who actually made it to college. It's a small act that is psychologically big in the minds of the people doing it. And there's a whole suite of wise interventions that have been developed. I want to make one thing really clear here, because it's easy for the science to get distorted. None of these is a quick fix. It's not like everything, these wise interventions, such as values affirmations, work all the time. They work under specific conditions. When other things in my life are going well, when I have opportunities in school to succeed, and there's channels to do it, then if you give me that kind of sense of being a person with value and strength through, say, values affirmation, then I'm more likely to seize those opportunities. So the effects of these kinds of interventions are conditional. And there's many more examples of these wise interventions, which in the right time, the right place for the right person, can change a destiny.
You have great examples in the book. There are lots of them. One is just when you're framing a critique of something, instead of just going in with the red pen, which you have to do if you're editing a kid's essay. Well, I'll let you finish the story.
Yeah, it's such important work. I mean, I think we face this dilemma all the time, and as mentors and friends and family member, how you deliver criticism, constructive criticism, in a way that's not discouraging but still informative. And most of the time, people don't actually learn from critical feedback. They don't want to hear it. Their defensiveness engages, and they feel threatened. So, how do you deal with that? Well, one strategy that was developed with my colleagues Claude Steele, Lee Ross, David Yeager, involves something really simple, another wise intervention. When you're giving criticism, especially when you're in a position of power, giving criticism to someone who's trying to make it in a field, say in school or at work, it can be very helpful to make it clear that your criticism is coming from your high standards and your belief in the person's potential to reach them. So just to give one example, we with teenagers had their teachers give them a raft of criticism on an essay that they wrote, and to give whatever encouragement they usually gave. And then for a random group of teenagers, we had the teachers pen an additional note that simply said, "I'm giving you this feedback because I have high standards and I believe that you can reach them." It's expressing a belief in someone's potential to become. And a lot of great mentors do this. They believe more, they see more in the person than maybe the person even sees in themselves. And this is just a way to kind of communicate this in the sort of minutia of an interaction. But so much hangs in how we do it. For example, we found that those students who got that note, this is a randomized double-blind trial, sparing you the methodological details, those students who got that note, the percentage of students who revise their essay jumped from 30% in the control group to 60%. Not only that, we found years later that those students, especially the students of color who often feel really uncertain about their belonging in school, they were less likely to get in trouble the next year as a result of getting that note. And years later, they were more likely to make it into college. So much of this, I remember a story that someone told me about a CEO who was a female product designer in the Silicon Valley, and she was trying to make it in a largely male-dominated profession, technology profession in the Silicon Valley. And she was about to give this sort of make or break speech, and she was really nervous. And her CEO came up to her and simply said, right before her talk, "You are changing this company." And because it was so timely, and because it was just what she needed to hear at that right moment to give her that confidence she needed, it had this whopping effect on her. She said, as a result, I just went in and I felt like I could express what I really thought without all this distracting chatter about whether I belong in my head. I think these are examples of small things, and there's many others that we can do that are more science-based beyond the more obvious that can make a big difference. And I've been so amazed and floored by the results over the years. Not to say these work every time, all the place, but in the right time for the right person. There's an art to kind of seeing it when they're called for. It can make a huge difference.
That's wonderful. So you say that a sense of belonging isn't a byproduct of success, but it's a condition for it. And you've just kind of demonstrated that a little bit. Yet the links in community groups now and decimation really of community because churches and bowling leagues don't run anymore. Is there any kind of way we could substitute back in that missing glue into our community? I mean, I know that when you walk a dog,
Yeah,
as opposed to walking on your own, just that changes everything in terms of your interaction with people and the amount of people who stop and talk to you about the dog. And it's like it
yeah.
gives this kind of social lubrication to an interaction which might be awkward,
That's right.
otherwise.
I think you're onto something there. Like common interests really bind people together, and they give people an excuse to talk. Joining clubs. I think volunteer groups are a great example of this. Joining volunteer groups tends to have these enormous effects on belonging for everyone, adults, young adults. Service. Vivek Murphy, our Surgeon General, has talked about this. The epidemic of loneliness can be solved in part by dedicating ourselves to volunteerism and service. So, almost nothing is as powerful in bolstering people's sense of connection with other people than working together to help others in common cause for a noble purpose. And that could just be something as simple as, um, working for a charity or doing tutoring for kids who need it, or going to an assisted living facility to help out, or even just looking at your work that way. I find this in my own life, just trying to look at my work and my interactions with students and my research, just looking at it as an opportunity to serve a higher purpose. Seeing it that way ends up making me feel much more connected. So I think, from having uh, dogs and cats that kind of bind us together to these higher purposes, sharing purpose and finding people in common cause with you is just one great way. And sometimes you got to be kind of proactive about it. You have to kind of put yourself out there. I think that's one of the big lessons of the research these days is belonging. You can't be passive about it. You got to be proactive. And so that means especially just joining a group, or if you need help, asking for help from someone who can provide it. Uh, and just seeing all the opportunities that I think pass us by every day. I'm a big fan of this work by Juliana Schroeder and Nick Epley about strangers on a train. And to make a long story short, what they do is they have people on a train, a subway train. They just ask them, "How would you feel about talking to a stranger for 15 minutes?" And they say, "That would make me feel bad. I don't want to do that." And then they actually have people do it, randomly assigning them. And they find that having a conversation with a stranger on a train consistently improves people's well-being and happiness. It's a thing that we don't think will make us happy, but just making that connection, reaching out, especially if you have some sort of reason to do so, can be very beneficial. And Nick Epley and his team have shown that many other things are kind of opportunities to connect, such as paying someone a compliment. We don't realize how positively impactful that can be. We underestimate it, he finds. Expressing gratitude. These things are ways for us to connect with others in the smallest corners of social life, and they really matter. So from the big to the small, we can all be proactive in creating those connections, even as our kind of the opportunities in larger society are dwindling. But maybe we can fight back and create more.
So I have to say, and I hate to be a Luddite here, because we all know technology has been a remarkably wonderful thing in many ways, but I was on the T a couple of weeks ago and I automatically count the number of people on their phones. I just do it. And there was 2 people out of everybody that was in my compartment that wasn't on a phone, that was reading.
Yeah.
And that used to be a place where you could have a conversation. I remember having conversations with people on the T, all sorts of people. That never happens anymore.
On the team?
On the T, on the subway.
On the T. Yes.
The
Yeah.
T is the Boston subway.
I got it. Thank you. Yeah, going back to Liz Dunn and her team, she finds that if you just have people put their phone away before having a conversation with friends or family, they have a much better time and they feel more connected. So
Somebody actually has written that into the questions here. I expect that Geoffrey will speak to the consequences of adults who are on their cell phones a large amount of time during what's supposed to be family time, for example, a holiday gathering or birthday party.
yes,
So I imagine
absolutely.
coming off Thanksgiving.
And I wish I could say I was guiltless in this, but I know I've done it too. We all do these things that kind of lead us astray. That's one of the points of the research, is that, this is a process. We have to have a kind of growth mindset about overcoming the reflexes that kind of lead us astray in forging connections, and to become more reflective in the choices that we make, so that we're fostering our own belonging in other people's. And I do think that, we're all, none of us finished products, and we're all works in process. And so I think the research and the wisdom, and just kindness in general will get us pretty far, and being reflective. And I loved your introduction. I think there's a great cause for hope. And as we know, hope is not a strategy, but I think there's also a lot of strategies grounded in science and also just kind of cultural wisdom that could help us realize our hopes.
And also rules. If you don't want to have people with their cell phones at your Thanksgiving table, then say this is the operating rules today, unless
Yeah.
you're an emergency physician on call.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they're doing increasingly at concerts, for example. Put your phone away.
Thank
For
goodness.
many reasons, but that being one of them.
So let's go to the bigger problems now. So there are lots of forces that are fueling division in our society and undermining this possibility of belonging, some of which are beyond our control. You mentioned institutionalized biases in the book, media that monetize fear, and also social media, which undercuts authenticity. Can you speak a bit more about these factors which help fuel mistrust and hate groups?
Well, when we're talking about extremism and hate, it's a really difficult topic, and I would not want to present myself at all as an authority. I think there's like so much to learn. But one thing that does, I think, come across in the work that's been done is that isolation, and that feeling of being left behind, a defeated need to belong. That's a key culprit. That's a key culprit in both extremism and hate crimes. Christian Picciolini, who was a former member of the neo-Nazi group. Now he runs an organization to kind of bring back extremists. He just put it very pithily. He said, you know, every former extremist will tell you the same thing. They didn't join the group because of their racist or ideological beliefs, at least not initially. They joined because they wanted to feel like they belonged. They wanted to feel like they belong. And so many stories confirm this. Like, I love the story of C.P. Ellis back in the 70s. You know, was The Best of Enemies was the book, and the movie was actually pretty good, but he was a member of the KKK, and he got out thanks to a friendship with a civil rights activist. He got out and became an advocate for civil rights. But he describes his experience joining the KKK. He was economically deprived. His family was in dire straits. He had very little to hope for, and he felt isolated. But when he knelt before the altar to be inducted into the KKK and heard that applause, he writes, or he says, I felt like somebody. I felt like someone who mattered. And that's what these groups offer. They exploit people's need to belong. They really do. They get it. They're very sophisticated. And that's very dangerous, I think, because we know, you know, when people feel left behind or rejected by the rest of society, or if they simply feel that their group has been left behind or rejected by the rest of the world, then, you know, they have that psychology that, as Roy Baumeister put it, if you can't join them, beat them. So I do think that belonging, defeated belonging, if we don't address this at a societal level and include everyone under the umbrella of a kind of common sense of purpose and belonging as much as we can, I know I'm being maybe idealistic here. If we don't do that, we're going to pay a price. And right now we're paying some of that price, I think.
Well, you mentioned in the book, actually, about wise interventions as defense mechanisms and curtailing our use of social media. But you've got an example involving Facebook in there, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, Facebook. Just getting off of Facebook, there's a big study here out of Stanford showing that when people got off of Facebook, they felt better, well-being went up, political polarization went down. In another study, getting off of social media increased people's involvement in civic associations like volunteer groups, social clubs, which we know are authentic sources of belonging. So I think social media, if it's not controlled, can kind of divert us from authentic sources of belonging and actually contribute to polarization. I know there's actually a large study from Facebook just recently suggesting that, yeah, I'll make a long story short, the amount of misinformation you get on Facebook doesn't really influence your polarization. But I do think the research does suggest getting off of Facebook is actually reduces political polarization, brings the two sides together, because we end up, I think, getting into our own silos and having our views reinforced on these platforms, which is pretty toxic. And not to mention all the fear mongering that goes on in the media and social media, which, you know, boils down to the strategy of be scared and buy.
Being scared and buy.
Be scared, be very scared, and buy this to quell your fears. It's the strategy.
Okay, so a big thing in the book that impressed me was part of the crux of some of the questions here, which is, you know, now people that are not like us kind of unsettle us, and it's almost a leap of faith sometimes to cross the divide. You say encounters with people who are unlike each other in meaningful ways define our diverse and unsettled world. but they also have the potential to enhance understanding. And you cite Andrew Solomon saying, difference unites us. Okay, so what do you suggest for like a conversation opener with someone who you know is on the opposite side of the political fence? I mean, any suggestions there?
Well, it's both mindset and strategy, I think. The mindset is having a sort of curiosity, desire to understand the other side, this other person and their views. Julia Minson has some research that suggests when people have that mindset, a kind of curiosity mindset, they end up having encounters across the political aisle that go better, and they come across as more interested. And actually, we find that that interest actually makes the other side a little bit more open to our point of view as well. So that's one thing. I think having this sort of genuine curiosity, desire to understand, that's one. And I know it's hard to maintain, but especially in the heat of the moment when someone says something that's so anathema to what you believe. But
what about prefacing your opinion?
Yeah. And then the toolkit is, there's probably two that I would highlight here. One is reflecting back what the person says. So, do I understand you? This is what you're saying. So you believe X on this issue because of Y and Z, and kind of having this kind of charitable style in which you try to summarize what the other person said to convey you heard, and attribute it to good motives, like, so because you value these things, that's why you feel this way. Do I understand that correct? So that's one thing. The second thing is to precede your point of view with two words: I think. So much of the time, I've relatives in my family, I have friends. I know I've done this too, where we frame our opinions as statements of facts, which can be really off-putting. Let me tell you how it is. You just don't get it, as if there's some truth out there that people need to get. Even if we're on the side of virtue, that stuff really does not work to bring people over to seeing our side. And some great research by a doctoral student in my lab, actually postdoc now, Michael Schwabe, has shown that when people express their views this way, two things happen. They're more inviting and welcoming to the other side. The other side actually ends up being more curious about their own points of view when people say, I think, or from my point of view. But also, additionally, the person who's speaking starts to change the way they think about their beliefs, and sees them, understands them to be more subjective. And as a result, they too become a bit more open-minded and critical of their own mind, so that they're more likely to kind of challenge their own assumptions, which we're often blind to. So I would say those two things: the mindset, curiosity mindset, plus reflecting back, plus using this kind of provisional language in which we really communicate that, hey, I'm just seeing this as this is my point of view. You kind of create a subjective sort of sandbox for people to kind of interact in. And I know some of these issues are really important, really volatile, and dear to our hearts. And, I get that. But we do ourselves no favors by talking in ways that evoke the other side's defensiveness. We give up opportunities to create allies.
You're right about that. I remember one time, just randomly, I was in Starbucks. This chap, older man, heard my accent, and he started talking about how important the Second World War, the Allies were. And I said, oh yeah, but we couldn't have done it without you. And then he made quite a racist comment, contemporary racist comment. And I said, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. I completely shut him down. And then he said, oh, why is that? And so I got my chance to kind of explain what I thought. But the very fact that I said, I'm sorry you feel that way, seemed to have quite a good effect upon the man's receptivity to what I was going to say next. Because I didn't diss what he said. I just kind of let him ponder it for a minute. This thing about what you say of reflecting, standing and reflecting, what are my core values?
That's such a lovely example. You kind of groove off that. Marshall Rosenberg, who was famous for having difficult conversations. He wrote a book called Nonviolent Communication. He talks about how he would talk with anti-Semites, racists, and his wisdom at the end of all of it. He said, I just learned to enjoy other people a whole lot more and get a lot more out of life by not getting too caught up with what's inside people's heads and instead listening to what's inside their hearts.
Mm.
And it was, kind of implicit in what you were saying. I'm sorry, you're kind of recognizing that there's some difficulty, maybe even some pain in the other person. And Rosenberg, was really, he understood that so much of what we say, so much of what we believe is an outcropping of underlying emotions and a really good, what's the word? It's a little like the martial arts of conversation. You want to do no harm, and you want to be aware of the forces at work that you cannot see. And one of them is the emotional undercurrents that we're just often unaware of. And digging in, finding out more about why the person feels that way can really do a lot of good. So
You actually have a term for that in the book where you say, I can't think of it. It's a functional something where you say, don't look at the person and judge them and contextualize that into something. So it becomes us and them, as though they represent something when we don't really know anything about that person, exactly as you say.
Yes. I mean, our minds are constantly, it's not totally our fault here. Our minds are constantly categorizing, rendering the novelty of every experience in terms of previously learned categories. And so we're constantly doing that. Like, this person is just another academic. This person is just another anti-Semite. This person is just another man or woman or whatever the case may be. We're continually assimilating people to existing categories and thereby kind of blinding ourselves to their individuality and who they really are. And becoming aware of that is the kind of first step to digging ourselves out of that hole.
And you also say people are a lot more complex.
People are a lot more people have
Yeah.
motivational complexities that we're unaware of. And I've seen that so many times in my life where someone does me some harm, or at least I perceive it that way. And then I find out years later, because I still keep up the relationship. Even though I could have shunned it. I find out years later, there's something going on in their life that I had no clue about. There's something in their context. And I think much of the time when people are acting objectionably or they let us down, it is because, one is this sort of defeated sense of belonging for one, but a lot of times there's something in their situations, not in themselves, in their situations, which is affecting them that we cannot see. And Lee Ross, one of my colleagues, has a term for this special kind of blindness in which we don't take the time to find out about other people's circumstances. Like, what are you going through? I want to know more and how it's affecting you. He calls that the fundamental attribution error. And it's fundamental because we attribute behavior, especially in our individualistic culture, to what's inside of people, their character, their aptitude, their grit, their wit, whatever. And we systematically neglect the power of the circumstances that they're dealing with. Lee finds even in situations where it's so patently obvious, someone is given an advantage in an intellectual game, we still think that that person is smarter than the person without that advantage. We are blind to the power of circumstance. And just becoming aware of that can really open our eyes to kind of give us that curiosity mindset and do one other thing, make us more likely to inquire into other people's circumstances, do what Nick Epley calls perspective get. Instead of just trying to imagine another person's point of view, get it, ask questions, listen to the answers. And that's one antidote to the fundamental attribution error and these kind of biases that blind us to the humanity of other people. And they're pretty powerful. And like you said, there's a lot of money at play to get us to see each other that way. So you almost have to kind of see your mind as this territory that media and social media are trying to colonize. And so you have to kind of engage in these calisthenics to kind of fight back against these biases that are being fueled by these larger forces.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. So you say stereotyping threatens belonging, obviously. And you've got a chapter called Situation Crafting in the book. So explain that. And then you also you had a research project which had to do with the dining hall at the University of Michigan. Yeah. So Maybe you could explain a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, situation crafting just refers to this idea that because so much of behavior comes from the circumstances or the situations people are in, rather than from their personality or their ability, of course, those things matter, but they're not the whole story. One of the things we can do is change situations to help people feel like they belong. The research suggests this, that the circumstances are a powerful driver of behavior, as we talked about, that we often don't see. To give it another example, this is also from Lee Ross and Steve Samuels, where he brings people in to play one of these competitive economic games where they can either be nice and cooperate with the other player, or be greedy and try to take the pot of money all for themselves. I'm really just simplifying it here. So the key question is, do people cooperate with a player, or do they defect and kind of pursue their avid self-interest? And people think that personality will matter, but Ross and Samuels find that actually people's reputations, the degree to which their friends judge them as selfish or cooperative, has no predictive power in terms of whether or not people cooperate or defect. But something else does matter, something in the situation. Whether the experimenter offhandedly refers to the game as the Wall Street game or the community game. When it's a Wall Street game, 80% of people defect, or sorry, 70% of people defect. When it's a community game, 70% of people cooperate. The name of the game trumps personality or reputation in the study and situation. So I love this study because it kind of makes you think, oh, maybe I can go through my life trying to kind of frame situations, use words that frame our everyday encounters more as community games rather than Wall Street games. And so little things can do this. Like there's work with teachers showing that teachers who use we and kind of verbiage of inclusion actually produce more belonging in their students and better achievement. Taking a lot of the things that we've been talking about are ways of crafting our situations to generate belonging in ourselves and others. That includes the kind of wise criticism that I talked about, invoking high standards and expressing a belief in people's potential. It includes affirming people's values. It also includes, situation crafting, because we're all part of the situation. By definition, we're all part of the situations that we're in with other people. We can, through our words and actions, choose ways to be that make the situation better. And here's one more example to give you of that. My colleague, Greg Walton, and I have developed a kind of another wise intervention where it simply involves having senior people at an organization, like senior students or senior people in management at a company, tell their stories of adversity and convey to newbies that, hey, you know what? When I first got here during this transition to college or to this work environment, I felt like I didn't belong, but it got better with time. And sharing those stories created a situation for the newbies, for the newcomers to feel, hey, I'm feeling like I don't belong here, but I now know it's normal and things will likely get better. And what that did in several studies is to improve performance and well-being and even some indicators of health. That's another way. These kind of little things that we can do in every single situation can help to create belonging in other people, especially. I feel like it's almost like a superpower, even just being polite, but as well as in ourselves. Now, I just wanted to make one caveat here. I'm talking about the ways in which we can craft situations down on the ground in our everyday interactions to make them better. Because ultimately, we have to deal with the hand we're dealt. We have to deal with the hand we're dealt. Every situation is happening and we have to make the most of it. But that is not to belittle the importance of systemic change and dismantling the many systems of exclusion, that undermine the real and felt belonging of members of many marginalized communities and at-risk groups and just so many people. Those systems of exclusion, discrimination for one, is like an obvious culprit. They need to be addressed. And that is I really want to just emphasize that we all need to push the ball forward in changing our societal situation in a way that cultivates belonging for all. Meanwhile, we can do a lot day to day to kind of fight the larger forces.
Somebody's actually asked a question along those lines. Can you comment on specific and concrete practices schools have adopted or can adopt to develop a culture of belonging that includes all students? And how does this culture get established?
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's two examples. I would say one is a technique designed by Elliot Aronson called the jigsaw classroom. I'll make a long story short. Basically, you create a kind of community game in the classroom rather than a Wall Street game. He found that many of our classrooms are incredibly competitive, even in elementary school. He was doing this work in the 70s, but it's still relevant today. And he was looking at schools in the aftermath of desegregation that were trying to integrate. And he just noticed that they were highly competitive. And this put minority students, the Latino and Black students, at a disadvantage because they actually came from, more disadvantaged schools. So they couldn't compete academically with the white students as well. And the competitive nature of the classroom actually increased prejudice and undermined the performance of minority students. What he did was to create what he called a jigsaw classroom. What's a jigsaw classroom? It's when you divide the lesson plan into pieces. So you create small groups of, say, 6 to 8 students within the classroom. Each student in the classroom is responsible for learning a piece of the lesson. So if it's like the life of Eleanor Roosevelt, one student has responsibility of learning her childhood history. One student has the responsibility of learning her entry into politics, etc. You break the lesson into 6 pieces. Each child, with the help of the teacher, becomes an expert on that one piece. Now, afterwards, the children who have had different pieces get together, and in order to learn the lesson, they all have to work together. The teacher says, you're going to be tested on the lesson after this session. And so what it does is to create a kind of game or a situation in the classroom where it becomes in students' self-interest to cooperate across racial lines. And this intervention has had positive impacts on minority students' achievement and reduced prejudice among white students, and even evoked lasting benefits in terms of nurturing cross-racial friendships. Jigsaw classroom. I know I'm kind of skirting over a lot of details. That's one intervention I would really highlight. Another is what's called an empathic teacher mindset intervention. This is by Jason Okanafua. To make a long story short, what he does is he teaches teachers many of the things that we're talking about here. If a student misbehaves, it's often because they don't feel like they belong in the classroom. Don't commit the fundamental attribution error. Learn to perspective get. If there's objectionable behavior from your students, find out more. And he gives them a suite of strategies in about a 2-hour module, and finds that halves the suspension rates at the schools among the teachers who got that intervention. That's teaching people to see other people, especially their students, in a charitable way and a more accurate way is another way to go. And then actually a quick third strategy is I would just do a quick call to Elizabeth Pollack, who's designed interventions which are basically little seed groups, little breakfast clubs of diverse groups of students who are just charged with a task with an adult leader or facilitator of creating belonging throughout their class, throughout their school. And these are little groups of 6 to 10 that are empowered to create changes in the school through various actions, and they kind of create ways to develop new policies, new incentives for the kids at their school to treat each other well. And she finds very large effects on reducing disciplinary problems in the schools and increasing students' sense of belonging, especially if there's a lot of popular kids in those little pods. So I call that the breakfast club strategy.
Somebody's written here, and I think it's a good point. If you look for the commonalities between people and not concentrate on the differences between you, you have something to build on. And this, Linda has said, looking for common ground as a place to start a difficult conversation is also helpful.
Absolutely. And, we often share the same values. We just see the situation very differently. And I agree with that. And another thing is, I want to do a call out for this work on deep canvassing, which, just finding like having a 10-minute conversation across political lines improves people's openness to the other side. And one thing they do is they emphasize emotional similarities. I'm thinking of some work by Brookman and Kala demonstrating that, where they just, They were trying to improve voters or increase voters' empathy for victims of transgender hate. And long story short, what they did is used a kind of emotional emotional empathy induction, where they just asked the voter, has there ever been a time in your life when you've been treated unfairly because of something about you that you couldn't change? And all of a sudden, people could really relate to the transgender issue, even though for many of these voters, it was in a conservative district, it felt strange and unfamiliar, and they were a bit opposed to it. But then all of a sudden, it kind of opened people up. But yeah, we've all been excluded. We all know the pain of not of being rejected. And one of the voters recalled how he came back from the Iraq War with PTSD, and no one would hire him. And all of a sudden, that kind of created a kind of bond of emotion that opened him up to an issue that was otherwise alien on the surface.
Okay, we've had a lot more questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but maybe afterwards, Nick, you can, if there's any responses, you can give these questions. Someone said, do pseudo or crypto friendships on social media inhibit or complement the formation of real friendship?
Well, I mean, the answer to that question is it depends. Depends on how you use it, right? And it can be used to create connection or not. And I think the research that I've seen, there's not a whole lot on it, but for one, you just want to kind of limit it to about 3 hours a day. Any more than that, it starts to be detrimental to your sense of belonging, I think. And if you use social media to kind of, to plan meetups and hangouts and, to join these kind of associations of common cause, then it could be really a catalyst for better connection in your life. But the problem is that what social media does is it often leads to these invidious social comparisons where people feel like they're inferior to other people who are living this bright, happy life, because people are kind of presenting on social media. And I think it really does, I would put it this way, it especially for teenagers at key developmental stages, it leads them to externalize their self-worth. So they're just kind of craving likes and status rather than authentic connection. And that's a really toxic thing, I think.
You also mentioned in the book, it's a question we all struggle with, I think, is that this actual feeling of belonging is quite a transient one. And we can go through waves in our life and groups in our life where we are belonging here and we're not belonging over there, and feeling that it's a very kind of precarious and indefinite. It's not a finite state you reach, doesn't seem to me. So how do we bolster it? And do some people have this feeling for life indefinitely that they just don't fit?
Well, I mean, I know I felt that for much of my life, that feeling of being an outsider, but I think it turns out it's a lot more shared than we think. It's kind of a form of what social psychologists call pluralistic ignorance, where the plurality is ignorant of the plurality. We don't know how much this binds us. The Andrew Solomon, to paraphrase Andrew Solomon, the sense of being different is one of the things that unites us. But we can be really proactive in creating belonging, right? Like as we've talked about throughout this session, and have a growth mindset about our ability to do it. It's a process that keeps going throughout the lifespan of finding our people and also finding ourselves, because you don't really feel belonging unless you're being fully yourself, I think. And you want to do that with the right people for sure, but if you're not fully yourself, if you can't be vulnerable, you never feel fully accepted. And so that's part of this process, is becoming strong enough and having the fortitude to fully be yourself and admit that and be honest and find someone who will accept you and find people who will accept you, warts and all, for being that way. And this is an ongoing process throughout our lives. I really, and sometimes we have to change our groups, as the saying goes, you can't change the people you're with, but you can change the people you're with.
That's very good. That's very good. Well, I can't believe it, but our hours are almost. And I would strongly advise people to get hold of this book or order it from the library. because he's got a whole section which are ways of thinking and behaving that support belonging, a whole list of them, which we didn't even get a chance to go through. But I really like the fact that you said we can help engineer each other's well-being, which is a lovely feeling. And help ourselves probably at the same time doing that. And it's achievable, and we can do it on a daily kind of basis. So, you know, little changes, maybe we didn't do so well yesterday, but tomorrow we might, you know, we can be more cognizant tomorrow, you know,
every
kind of like,
every moment is a new beginning.
that's lovely. That's lovely. Okay, well, I'm sorry we didn't get all to the millions of questions we got here.
Oh,
but I'm going to thank you, Geoffrey, for making the time and sharing all these insights to help us all build bridges and be better people. And keep up your diligent research there at Stanford. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, Cambridge Community Foundation, and you. And I'm not going to say anything about giving anything today because everybody in the world is asking you to donate today. But information about us is available on www.cambridgeforum.org about all our programs. We make NPR broadcasts of the program, and our wonderful partners, GBH Forum Network, will upload a video of this shortly to YouTube, so you can get to see it again, share it with your friends. Thanks to everybody for joining us and for sending in your wonderful comments and questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all. Hope to see you all soon, and thanks again, Jeff.